I'm Victor. I'm 48, an investment banker, and I've built my life on planning and precision. Been in the game for over 20 years now, and in my line of work, you learn early that things can change on a dime if you're not paying attention. Maybe that's why I saw Sophie's betrayal coming long before she thought she'd slipped. I was never the guy who acted on impulse. My whole life was about timing, careful moves, and staying 2 steps ahead. It's how I went from a nobody intern to managing accounts with numbers big enough to make your head spin. And I wasn't just good at it, I thrived on it. People trusted me because they knew I didn't miss anything. They'd say, if Victor's on it, it's as good as done. Funny, the same habits that kept my career rock solid ended up saving me in my marriage too. At least until Sophie decided she needed a different kind of adventure. We'd been married 17 years, and for a long time, I thought she was happy too. I tried to give her stability, someone who wouldn't leave her guessing or turn our life into chaos. But maybe that's where I was wrong, assuming she wanted stability when all along she was out there looking for excitement. She started showing up late, with lousy excuses. I'd catch her glancing at her phone, smiling to herself, pulling back a little too quickly if I walked by. I started noticing that she'd smell like a cologne I'd never worn, something bold and musky, nothing like what I'd wear. Turns out that cologne belonged to Daniel. I'd met the guy once or twice, a friend of a friend who I thought was just another passing face. But then, suddenly, he was everywhere. He's the opposite of me. Charming, loud, the kind of guy who'd do things just for the thrill of it. Sophie's probably convinced herself she's in love or that this is real happiness. But if she really thinks she's just going to leave me, live out this fantasy with Daniel, and get away clean, she's got no idea what I'm capable of. I don't show my hand too soon. Once Sophie made the decision, she wasted no time. One day she was here, sitting across from me at the breakfast table, laying down the word divorce like it was the end of a business transaction. A week later, she was practically sprinting out the door, bags packed, ready to head toward her new life with Daniel. It was surreal. In the blink of an eye, our 17 years together were treated like something she could discard on a whim. I watched her that day, lugging out her bags, her face tight with determination, and maybe a touch of excitement she was trying to hide. She didn't know I'd been keeping tabs on her little affair for months now. I didn't yell or plead or give her any of the reactions she probably expected, and honestly, I think that threw her off. She even lingered at the door, giving me one last look, maybe wondering if she'd missed something. But I kept my face blank and nodded as she left. Let her think it was a clean break. I knew Daniel too. Not well, but enough. He's the kind of guy who thrives on other people's attention, lives for the thrill of it. He has this big, friendly energy that fills a room, a guy who's never been told no a day in his life, probably because he always came off as so easygoing, charming. He wasn't the sort to settle down or take any real responsibility. But maybe that was the appeal for Sophie, that something new she thought she was missing. But while she was busy getting swept up in the fantasy, I was right here, already laying the groundwork for my own plan. I'd been managing our finances since day one, and Sophie never once questioned it. She'd call me her finance guy, joking about how she'd be lost if anything ever happened to me. She barely even glanced at the statements I showed her. They were just numbers to her, my responsibility. All those years, I made sure everything was meticulous, perfectly in order. Every investment, every bill. She had no idea how much I knew about her financial habits, her spending patterns, even the passwords she probably thought she'd come up with on her own. So the first thing I did was start slipping in small errors. Little discrepancies, things most people would shrug off, but when you're living off a fixed amount of savings, like Sophie was now, they add up quickly. She called me once, a little while after moving in with him, about a weird charge on her credit card. "You think this bank is just sloppy, or what?" she'd asked, a forced laugh in her voice, probably trying to sound casual. I just played dumb, agreed with her, saying banks mess up sometimes. "Just call them and sort it out," I told her. I could almost hear her frustration through the phone, her patience running thin as she struggled to understand what was going on. By the second month, it was like the whole financial system was turning against her. Her credit limit dropped without warning. Her utilities, which she'd never thought twice about before, suddenly spiked. The unusual activity, flags kept her tied up on hours-long calls with bank reps who didn't know what was going on any better than she did. I knew exactly how maddening it could be. One of those endless bureaucratic loops with no one able to give you a straight answer. By the time Sophie got off each call, she'd be more drained, more suspicious that her luck was turning, but still totally oblivious to my involvement. One night, I heard from a mutual friend that she'd been venting, claiming her finances had suddenly turned into a nightmare. I couldn't help but smile a little. If she thought this was rough, she hadn't seen anything yet. Once Sophie started feeling the pressure with her finances, I knew it was time to target her where it would hurt even more, her social life. Sophie's friends had always been important to her. More important, honestly, than I'd realized until now. She had this tight-knit group that made her feel like she was still in the center of something, still admired. They were her support system, the ones she'd turn to now that she was out on her own. So I thought, why not twist that knife a little? I started by hiring a few private investigators. Not your typical tough guy types, but people who knew how to blend in, people who could slip into a group unnoticed and be everyone's new best friend in a matter of weeks. These friends worked slowly, subtly, worming their way into Sophie's social circles. It wasn't long before one of them got close to Sophie's closest friend, Miranda. Miranda was the type who loved a little drama, who liked to feel like she was in the know. Through careful conversations and planted concerns, my people began sowing seeds of doubt, all focused on one thing, Daniel. Hey, Daniel has a bit of a reputation, they'd say over coffee. Or, did you ever hear about how he treated his last girlfriend? These were things Miranda lapped up, eager for any hint that Sophie's shiny new romance wasn't as perfect as she thought. And, of course, Miranda would pass those concerns straight to Sophie, always under the guise of looking out for her. From what I heard, Sophie was already starting to get paranoid, constantly second-guessing her choices. She'd built this perfect little fantasy with Daniel, but now, every time she looked at him, she was seeing him through these cracks we'd created. Every late-night text he got, every time he looked at another woman too long, she'd wonder if maybe he wasn't as reliable as he'd seemed. And her friends, her closest support, were all too happy to fuel those doubts. As Sophie's confidence started to crumble, my friends were right there to offer their shoulder, their sympathy. They'd listen as she vented, as she questioned everything. And every time, they'd give her just the right amount of reassurance to keep her on edge, to keep her wondering if leaving me had been the biggest mistake of her life. She had no idea these people weren't her friends. They were paid professionals, playing their roles to perfection. By the time I'd heard from a friend about her latest meltdown, some story of her accusing Daniel of being too secretive, I knew the plan was working. Sophie was on her own, surrounded by people she thought she could trust, but who were only there to make her doubt herself at every turn. Once Sophie was tangled up in doubts about Daniel, I decided it was time to hit her where she was most vulnerable, her relationship with him. She'd traded me in for this new life, this new man, convinced he was the answer to everything I couldn't give her. I wanted to make her question every single thing she'd built with him, make her wonder if he was just another mistake. I hired a woman named Allison, a professional actress with a knack for playing whatever role was needed. She was perfect for this. I had her pose as an old flame of Daniel's, someone who could easily weave her way into Sophie's life and drop the bombshells right where they'd hurt most. Allison didn't just look the part. She knew exactly how to make a story believable, exactly which emotional strings to pull. Allison accidentally ran into Sophie at one of her regular coffee spots and struck up a casual conversation. She was warm, friendly, the kind of woman Sophie would feel comfortable with right away. After a couple of coincidental meetups, they exchanged numbers, and before long, Allison was a staple in Sophie's new circle. She played her cards perfectly, becoming the supportive friend while carefully planting little doubts about Daniel. She'd hint that she and Daniel had a history, that he'd been a great love of hers once, but that things had ended because he couldn't commit. He's complicated, she'd say with a knowing smile, just enough to make Sophie's mind spin. Then came the final act. Over lunch one day, Allison told Sophie how Daniel had broken her heart, how he'd been charming, passionate, and so convincing, but that he'd eventually left her feeling used and discarded. She spun a tale of how he'd led her on, promised her the world, and then disappeared without a second thought. She even hinted that he'd cheated on her when they were together, letting Sophie know that he had a pattern of betraying trust. The timing couldn't have been better. Sophie was already on edge, doubting herself, doubting Daniel. Now she had this vivid picture of him as a manipulative liar, someone who had done this before and might very well be doing it again. She started seeing signs everywhere. Every time Daniel was late or distracted, every message he brushed off as just a friend, she'd feel that gnawing suspicion. I could practically imagine her lying awake at night, staring at him, wondering if he was the man she thought he was or if she was just another in a long line of his casual flings. The best part? Daniel had no idea any of this was happening. He was just living his life, completely unaware that Allison was out there, quietly tearing down his relationship one story at a time. And Sophie, in all her paranoia and jealousy, would never think to confront him openly. She'd stew in her suspicions, let them eat away at her from the inside, and soon enough, her perfect new life would start looking a whole lot like a trap. And for once, I felt like I was the one in control. With Sophie's life unraveling socially and emotionally, the final piece was the legal side of things. This was where I knew I could make the most impact, taking away not just her money but any hope she had of a cushy new beginning. I didn't just want her inconvenienced, I wanted her to feel the weight of her choices, to see that every safety net she thought she had was gone. My lawyer, Mark, was exactly who I needed for this. He'd been handling our legal affairs for years, and I trusted him to stay sharp and ruthless. Together, we went through everything, stacking up all the pieces that would paint her as impulsive, financially reckless, and downright irresponsible. Every erratic charge on her accounts, every debt she'd ignored, every desperate call to customer service over errors that were really just my handiwork. Mark documented it all, presenting a clear picture of someone spiraling out of control. The day we walked into the courtroom, I was calm. I knew exactly what to expect, every angle already mapped out. Sophie, on the other hand, looked tense, frazzled. She'd always taken pride in her looks, but she hadn't kept up with that lately. She looked worn, like someone who'd been fighting a losing battle for months. She tried to hold herself together, but her words came out shaky, defensive. She tried to paint herself as the wrong party, as someone who'd had no choice but to leave, but the details didn't match up with her story. Every question, every answer chipped away at the image she'd hoped to present, until there was barely anything left of the confident, defiant woman she'd been when she first announced she wanted to leave. Mark made sure the judge saw everything, especially how unstable Sophie had become since she'd left. He laid out her financial chaos, her hasty decisions, and her dependence on Daniel, who didn't even bother to show up to support her. As each point landed, I watched her face, saw the way her resolve cracked bit by bit. When the decision finally came down, it was everything I'd prepared for. Sophie was awarded the bare minimum, a fraction of what she'd expected. There'd be no grand escape, no easy start. She'd walk away with just enough to get by, nowhere near enough to keep living the comfortable life she'd imagined for herself. I left the courthouse that day without looking back. She'd made her choices, and now she was going to live with them. After the court had done its part, I wanted to deliver one final personal blow, something that would make her feel the weight of everything she'd thrown away. I'd been planning this for weeks, waiting until the moment was right, until I knew it would hit her at her lowest. One day, about a month after the court ruling, Sophie got a letter in the mail. No name, no return address, just a plain envelope slipped into her stack of bills and junk mail. When she opened it, she found a neatly typed note. The words were warm, almost tender, like they'd been written by someone who knew her deeply, who understood her better than anyone else. The letter spoke of forgiveness, of understanding, of how everyone deserves a second chance. Even someone like her, who'd made mistakes, who'd let her life slip through her fingers. It promised that better things were ahead if she could just hold on a little longer. I can only imagine the small glimmer of hope she must have felt as she read those words. Maybe she thought someone still cared, that despite everything, she wasn't as alone as she'd begun to feel. But as she got to the last few lines, the tone changed. The writer started listing off intimate details, things only someone who'd been watching her every move would know. Her endless calls to customer service, her fights with Daniel, her financial issues, her insecurities about her friends. She'd realized there was only one person who could know all this. Only one person who'd been watching her fall from the very start. The final line read, "I didn't need cameras to watch you crumble, Sophie. I was always a step ahead." I imagined her face as she read those words, as she felt that small flicker of hope she'd built crumble into nothing. The walls were closing in, the escape she'd dreamed of had turned into a nightmare, and the person she'd underestimated the most had been behind it all along. She had thought she could leave me, tear apart the life we'd built, and walk away without a scratch. But she'd learn, right here, at the bottom of it all, that she'd been wrong. After that letter, Sophie's world seemed to unravel faster than even I'd planned. Her relationship with Daniel, already strained from weeks of paranoia and doubt, finally reached its breaking point. She'd been pulling away from him, questioning every move he made, watching him like he was a stranger. It didn't take long for the cracks to split wide open. One evening, I heard from a mutual acquaintance that they'd seen Sophie and Daniel at a restaurant, arguing. According to them, Sophie's voice was low but fierce, her words sharp, biting. Daniel looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat, glancing around, probably hoping no one he knew would catch him in the middle of this mess. He must have felt cornered, dealing with her suspicions, her endless questions, the accusations. She was pushing him, looking for signs of betrayal that weren't even there, but I knew he wouldn't be able to handle it for long. Not long after, Daniel packed his bags. I could picture the scene, him sighing, frustrated, explaining that he hadn't signed up for this, that he needed space or time to think. The usual lines people throw around when they're looking for the door. Sophie, who'd left her stable life for him, found herself alone and stranded. And I knew exactly how isolated she felt because I'd made sure she'd cut off or doubted almost everyone she used to rely on. The day after Daniel left, I got a call from her. The first in months. I let it ring a few times, just enough to make her wonder if I'd answer, then picked up, staying silent to make her speak first. "Victor," she said, her voice quieter than I'd ever heard it, with none of the edge or confidence she'd once had. I just wanted to talk. I knew what she wanted, could hear it in the small pauses, in the way she grasped for words, but I stayed silent. If she expected pity, if she wanted a moment of softness, a hint that maybe I'd be her shoulder to lean on, she'd get nothing from me. "I didn't realize how things would turn out this way," she continued, barely able to get the words out. Maybe I made a mistake." There it was, the faintest hint of regret. But I'd been waiting for this, for her to feel every inch of the pain she'd caused, for her to understand the full extent of what she'd done. I kept my voice flat, unfeeling. "You're right, Sophie. You did." There was silence on the line, a small hollow pause that told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't just alone, she was empty, every bit of the life she'd planned crumbling around her. When I finally ended the call, I felt a weight lift. In the days that followed our last call, I figured that was it. That Sophie was finally gone from my life. She'd burned every bridge she'd had, and whatever vision she'd had of a new life was already in pieces. I knew she must have felt trapped, with nowhere to turn, and I was more than ready to close the door on this chapter. But then, out of nowhere, my phone rang one evening, and it was Miranda, Sophie's closest friend, and someone who, frankly, I hadn't expected to hear from again. There was a hesitation in her voice, a nervous edge, like she wasn't sure how to start. "Victor," she said slowly, almost like she was testing the water, "I hope you don't mind me reaching out. This is about Sophie." I couldn't help but feel a pang of curiosity. "Go on." "She's not doing well," Miranda said, picking her words carefully, like she was trying to gauge how much sympathy I'd have. "She keeps bringing you up. I think she's just feeling really alone, maybe even guilty. She mentioned she's been wondering if she made the wrong choice, if there's any way she could fix things." Miranda's voice trailed off, almost awkward, as if she couldn't quite believe she was saying it herself. She knew Sophie as well as anyone and had probably watched her entire life implode from the sidelines. And yet here she was, carrying this message for her friend, clearly uncomfortable with it but doing it anyway. I could picture Sophie behind all this, pushing her friend to reach out, too proud or ashamed to call me herself. "She wanted me to ask if you'd be willing to meet with her," Miranda finally said, each word falling more slowly than the last. "Just to talk, maybe to get a little closure." I let the request hang in the silence a few seconds, making it clear I wasn't moved. "I'm busy, Miranda," I said flatly. "There's nothing left to say. Whatever she wants, it's too late for it now." Miranda sighed, sounding like she was more relieved than disappointed, as if she'd known deep down that this was a fool's errand. "I thought you'd say that," she admitted, almost apologetic. Before hanging up, I added a final message, one that I knew would find its way back to Sophie. "If she asks again, tell her I've moved on. That maybe it's time she did too." I put the phone down, thinking of the woman Sophie used to be, the woman who'd once been so sure she could start over without a backward glance. But now she was the one left with regrets, the one scrambling for sympathy from people who didn't even know her anymore. The same woman who'd left me was now grasping for something she'd never get, answers and closure that I had no intention of giving her. She'd made her choices, and now I'd made mine. In the weeks that followed Miranda's call, I began to notice something strange. It seemed like no matter how much I tried to move forward, Sophie's presence kept creeping back into my life. I'd find myself scrolling through social media, seeing old photos of us tagged by mutual friends, or running into people who'd known us as a couple. They'd bring her up casually, asking how she was, if I'd heard from her, or offering some pitying comment about how different she seemed these days. Then, one morning, I got an unexpected email. It was from an old friend, someone Sophie and I had known since our early days, someone I hadn't spoken to in ages. The message was short, almost abrupt. "Hey Victor. I don't know if you've seen Sophie lately, but I ran into her at a coffee shop downtown. She looked, well, different. Just wanted to check in and make sure you're doing all right." There was something strange about that email, about the fact that people were noticing her decline. Sophie, who'd always kept up appearances, who'd always cared about looking her best, now had friends questioning her well-being. It was as if everything I'd put in motion had rippled out further than I'd even intended. But even with all that, I was ready to let it all go, to truly leave her in the past. That's when a voicemail from Sophie herself landed in my inbox. I almost deleted it on sight, a reflex to remove her from my life before she could worm her way back in. But some small part of me wanted to hear what she had to say, just this once. Maybe curiosity got the better of me. I pressed play and listened. Her voice, the same voice that used to be sharp and clear, was barely recognizable. She spoke in a hushed, almost defeated tone, as if the weight of her choices had finally settled on her shoulders. "Victor. It's me, Sophie," she began, then paused, as if she wasn't sure where to start. "I don't even know if you'll hear this, but I don't know. I feel like I'm missing something." She let out a shaky breath, her words faltering. "I thought I knew what I was doing. I thought this was what I wanted." She trailed off, the silence stretching out. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "I guess I just wanted to know if you ever felt that way too. If, maybe there's a chance we could talk. Just talk." I sat there, the voicemail still playing as her words echoed in my mind. I could hear the regret, the desperation in her voice, the uncertainty that had probably crept up on her in the dead of night, as she lay in the life she'd chosen and realized she'd traded everything real for something hollow. There was a time when I might have felt something for her, some trace of pity or forgiveness. But now, all I felt was a sense of finality, like a book being closed for good. She'd been so sure of her choices, of the life she thought would make her happier, freer. And here she was, circling back, hoping for scraps of sympathy from the man she'd once dismissed. I knew that answering her call, even entertaining the idea of talking, would only pull me back into the chaos she'd left behind. I deleted the message without a second thought, feeling a strange sense of relief. For the first time, it felt like I was truly free. Free from the memories, the questions, and, finally, from her. Sophie's message marked the end of something. I felt it, a finality I hadn't expected, like some invisible weight had lifted. For the first time, I was done looking back, done checking over my shoulder to see if she'd pop up in my life again. The next few weeks passed quietly, the way I'd been hoping for since this whole thing started. Work was steady, friends kept me busy, and the routines I'd rebuilt for myself felt solid, unshakable. Life was finally normal again, and it felt good. Then, one Sunday afternoon, I decided to stop by an old friend's birthday party. It was one of those casual gatherings, backyard barbecue, cold beers, familiar faces. I felt a little out of place at first, surrounded by people who'd known Sophie and me as a couple. But soon enough, I eased into the rhythm of things, catching up with friends, talking about work, even making a few people laugh with a joke or two. At one point, I found myself in a quiet corner with Greg, an old college friend who'd been close to both of us. He hesitated before he spoke, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Look, Victor," he said, keeping his voice low. "I've run into Sophie a few times. I hate to bring her up, but she's not doing well. And honestly, it looks bad." I shrugged, doing my best to keep my reaction neutral. "I've heard. Guess she got what she wanted, right?" He shook his head, looking more serious than I'd seen him in a long time. "It's different, man. I don't think she has a clue what to do with herself now. She's lost." There was something strange about the way he said it. A part of me wanted to brush it off, but Greg was one of the more grounded friends we'd had, never dramatic, never one to get involved in gossip. The fact that he was telling me this, that he thought it was important enough to pull me aside, made me pause. Look, I'm not saying you owe her anything, he continued, his eyes fixed on mine. But she's fallen apart, man. Whatever she thought she was looking for, it's gone. And from what I can tell, she doesn't have anyone left. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and awkward. I could tell Greg wanted to say more, to ask if I'd reached out, if I'd even consider it. But I knew better. Sophie's life was her own now. She'd cut herself off from me, from the stable life we'd had. If she was lost, if she didn't know how to find her footing, that was a consequence of the choices she'd made, not my responsibility. Thanks for letting me know, Greg, I said, keeping my voice steady, giving him nothing to work with. But there's nothing left between us. She made her choice, and I've made mine. He nodded, not pushing it any further. And for the rest of the party, he didn't bring it up again. But as I drove home that night, I couldn't help but think about how far Sophie had fallen, how she'd gone from being the confident woman I'd once loved to someone people pitied, someone her friends worried about in whispers. I'd done my part to set things in motion, but the rest of her spiral? That was all hers. That night, I went to bed feeling a strange sense of closure. I'd done everything I'd set out to do, and Sophie was the one left facing the consequences. For the first time in months, I slept soundly, knowing there was nothing left to worry about, nothing left to prove. The weeks after that conversation with Greg were some of the most peaceful I'd had in a long time. I felt like I was settling back into my life again. No reminders of Sophie, no whispers from friends, no unexpected messages or calls. Just quiet. I focused on work, started going to the gym more, even took up a hobby I'd always wanted to try but had never had time for, photography. It was like I was finally reclaiming my life, piece by piece. One afternoon, while I was out in the park with my camera, trying to catch the light filtering through the trees, I got a text from Mark, my lawyer. Victor, give me a call when you get a chance. It's about Sophie. At first, I felt that old familiar annoyance rising up, a small pang of irritation that somehow she was back in my life again. But I took a deep breath, put my camera down, and dialed his number. Whatever it was, I'd handle it quickly and be done. Mark picked up on the first ring. Hey, Victor. Sorry to bother you. This might be nothing, but I thought you'd want to know. What's going on? I asked, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. Apparently, Sophie's filed for a financial review, he said. She's claiming financial hardship. I'm guessing the money she left with is, well, running out. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. It looks like she's trying to see if there's any way she can get more. I almost laughed. She'd taken our settlement without a fight, barely bothering to negotiate. She'd walked out of that courtroom thinking she had everything she needed to start over. But here she was, only a few months later, looking for a way to stretch the life she'd barely even built. She signed the papers. Mark. I assume there's nothing she can do. No, not unless there's evidence of some major change, he said, with a hint of a smile in his voice. But she's reaching. She's filed for some consultation to see if there's any legal loophole, any detail she might have missed. She might be looking to bring this back into court. I could hear the faint note of amusement in Mark's voice, and for a second, I almost felt the same. Sophie, who had left so confidently, who had expected this grand new life, was backtracking, trying to claw her way out of the mess she'd created. And here I was, with nothing to lose. Let her try, I said. If she wants to waste her time and her money looking for ways to reopen this, that's on her. She's not getting a cent more. Mark chuckled. Glad to hear it. I'll handle anything that comes up. Just thought you'd want to know she's... well, let's just say she's starting to run out of options. As I hung up, I couldn't help but feel that strange, twisted satisfaction again. The woman who had once thought she could build a new life without me, without looking back, was now scrambling to fix her mistakes, hoping I'd be her safety net. And I'd never felt more certain that she'd find nothing but empty air beneath her. I picked up my camera again, focused it on a spot of sunlight breaking through the leaves, and clicked. There was something so final in that small shutter sound, like the closing of a door that I'd never need to open again. With Mark handling the legal side of things, I went back to my life, more resolved than ever to put everything about Sophie behind me. I'd finally reached a place where thoughts of her felt distant, like memories of a different person, a different time. And for a while, things stayed quiet. I'd catch myself feeling a sense of calm I hadn't felt in years, like I was stepping out into fresh air after being shut in a dark room. Then one evening, I was out with friends at a local pub, just unwinding. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed this. Just simple laughter, good conversation, and no tension hanging over my shoulders. I was about to head to the bar for another round when my friend Matt leaned in, his expression hesitant, and said, "Victor, you might want to hear this. It's about Sophie." I felt a brief flash of frustration but forced myself to stay calm. "What is it?" I asked, more curious than I wanted to admit. Matt shifted, lowering his voice. "Look man, I wasn't going to bring it up, but I heard she's hit rock bottom. Lost her apartment, her car's gone, well, I heard she's moving back in with her parents." He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of telling me this. I took a moment to absorb it. There she was, the same woman who had once stood across from me, so sure of herself, so convinced she could start a better life without me. Now forced to go back to her roots, back to where she'd started. It was like watching someone finally wake up to the reality they'd ignored for so long, only to find they'd lost everything along the way. Matt looked at me carefully. "She mentioned you," he added quietly, as if he was treading on thin ice. "Said you were the only person who ever really kept her grounded. She's even been telling people she regrets the divorce." Those words hung in the air, and I felt a strange, unexpected mix of emotions. Part of me was surprised, another part almost amused. But mostly, I felt a deep sense of validation. Sophie had reached the end of her rope, realized what she'd thrown away, and now, with her life in pieces, she was left grasping for something she couldn't get back. "Thanks for letting me know, Matt," I said, keeping my voice steady, not giving away a hint of what I was thinking. "But that chapter's closed. Whatever she's going through now, it's her life to figure out." Matt gave me a respectful nod, understanding the finality in my words. We went back to our conversation, my friends quickly filling the air with laughter and stories, and I let myself get swept up in it all, feeling lighter somehow. When I got home that night, I poured myself a glass of scotch and stood by the window, looking out at the city lights. The thought of Sophie, of her sitting alone, retracing her steps, realizing everything she'd lost, left a strange satisfaction. She'd made her choices, and now, for the first time, I felt fully at peace with mine. In the weeks after hearing about Sophie's situation, I felt a renewed sense of closure, like the last pieces of our past had finally settled. I'd thought of her as someone I barely knew now, a stranger whose choices had only confirmed what I'd suspected all along, that she'd never really understood what she'd had until she'd lost it. And for the first time I was okay with that. Life was calm, I'd thrown myself into work and the new hobbies I'd picked up, and I felt steady, grounded. Then, one morning, I was in my office, sorting through emails, when my assistant knocked on the door. She handed me an envelope, a thick one with my name scrawled in Sophie's handwriting. Seeing her name on that envelope took me off guard. I hadn't expected any new communication from her. I debated tossing it aside but ultimately decided to see what she had to say. Inside was a handwritten letter. The words were shaky, as if she'd stopped and started 100 times. She wrote about regret, about how she'd never imagined things would go the way they had. She explained how her life had unraveled piece by piece, how everything she'd thought she wanted had turned to ashes in her hands. There were lines about loneliness, about feeling empty, about all the people she thought would be there for her but weren't. And then, the part that stood out most, "Victor, I know I've made mistakes, and I don't expect forgiveness. I understand now that the life I thought I wanted was never real. But losing you, that was the one thing I never prepared for. I miss the stability, the calm, the way you kept me grounded. I realize now that you were the best thing that ever happened to me." She went on to ask, almost hesitantly, if I'd be willing to meet. "Just once," she wrote, "so I can say the things I should have said before I left." She didn't ask for a second chance. She didn't try to persuade me that things would be different. It was almost as if she was trying to find her own closure, her own sense of peace, hoping to gain back even a small piece of what she'd left behind. I sat there, rereading the letter, feeling an odd mixture of emotions. This was what I'd been waiting for, wasn't it? The realization, the apology, the admission that she'd been wrong. But as I looked at her words, all I could feel was how distant they seemed. I'd spent so long rebuilding myself, finally coming to terms with who I was without her, that the idea of meeting her, of revisiting all that pain and regret, felt unnecessary. I folded the letter, slipped it back into the envelope, and put it in my desk drawer. Sophie had made her choice, and she'd finally realized its cost. But whatever she needed to find peace with, she'd have to do it on her own. After Sophie's letter, I thought she'd let things go, but 2 weeks later, another envelope arrived. Inside was a short note, her handwriting shaky. "Please, Victor. I just want one conversation. No expectations. Just a chance to talk. I know I don't deserve it, but I don't know who else to turn to." For a moment, I remembered how we'd met, when we were young and both just starting out, filled with plans. Seeing her name signed at the bottom of that note brought a strange hollow feeling, like I was looking at a ghost of someone I'd once known. Ignoring her again crossed my mind. I had found my closure. My life was steady. I'd rebuilt myself. But something, maybe curiosity or a last bit of respect, made me agree to meet her. If this conversation would help her move on, maybe it would finally end things for good. We set a time at a quiet cafe, away from familiar faces. I arrived early, taking a seat in the back, watching the door. Sophie walked in, glancing around, looking more fragile than I'd ever seen her. She wasn't the self-assured woman who'd left. She looked worn, as if weighed down by everything that had happened. She sat across from me, and for a moment, we sat in silence. Finally, she spoke, her voice low. "Thank you for meeting me, Victor. I know I didn't deserve this, but I needed to see you." I nodded, keeping my expression calm. "What did you want to say?" She took a deep breath, looking me in the eye. "I wanted to apologize. I thought I was chasing happiness, freedom, but I threw away everything that mattered. I was wrong, Victor. About everything." Her words hung in the air. She spoke about the decisions she'd made, the loneliness, and regrets that came too late. When she finished, she looked at me, waiting for a response, maybe a hint of forgiveness. But I had nothing to give her. She'd made her choices, and I'd made mine. Finally, I leaned forward, meeting her gaze. "Sophie, I appreciate the apology. But we're in different places now. I've moved on, and you'll have to too. What we had is over, and nothing will bring it back." She looked down, nodding slowly as acceptance settled in. I could see she understood. This conversation wouldn't change anything. We sat in silence until she stood, giving me a faint, sad smile. "Thank you, Victor. I needed to hear that." And with that, she walked away, leaving me with a profound sense of closure. Whatever we'd once been was gone, buried for good. And as I watched her go, I knew it was really over. After that final meeting, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't known in a long time. Sophie's apology had closed a chapter, but it was more than that. It was a reminder of how far I'd come, how much I'd rebuilt in the time since she'd left. I no longer felt that pull of the past, the need for answers, or any trace of regret. Life felt simpler, cleaner. Months passed quietly. My routines deepened, my work picked up, and friends started noticing a change in me. "You seem lighter," Matt mentioned one night over dinner. And he was right. There was a lightness, a freedom in knowing I'd finally moved past it all, leaving no pieces left to pick up. Then, on a sunny afternoon, I received one last piece of news about Sophie. It came from Greg, the same friend who'd been hesitant to share updates on her before. We ran into each other at the park, and after catching up, he hesitated before mentioning her. "I heard Sophie's doing better," he said, cautiously. "She moved back to her parents, got a part-time job, even started volunteering. She's not the same person she was, but maybe that's for the best." I nodded, genuinely glad to hear it, but I felt no pull to reach out, no curiosity beyond that brief update. Sophie was living her life, and I was fully living mine. I went home that evening, stood by my window, looking out at the city, reflecting on everything. I'd come through the worst of it, finding my own path, my own peace. Whatever lay ahead, it was my own to shape, without anyone else's shadow lingering over it. And as the sun set over the skyline, I knew that I'd finally moved forward, for good.